Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yes.
Hello, dear.
Hello.
Yes, hello.
Hello. I am great. I am very glad to see all of you here. Thank you for joining us for this event. It took us some time together, and I hope we have now opportunity to discuss the policy briefs that we prepared and share it with the audience. I will now say some important words to explain to participants. Just a moment, sorry, there are some things that I should tell you. First of all, our seminar will be in English on Zoom. You can switch to simultaneous Russian translation by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom window and choosing Russian. The option also available in the Zoom mobile application toolbar. There will be also some interactive question that I will ask at some point in our roundtable, and everyone can answer it in chat. And you can also ask questions in chat. We will later on distribute this question to panelists in order to answer them during discussion. We have very distinguished group of panelists today. I will introduce them one by one when they will be speaking to save time. And few introductory words that I would want to say is that today we will probably be one of the first such it will be one of the first discussion of the issue in Russia, and I'm very glad that we start it at New Economic School. Me and my colleagues participate in the network of Eastern European think tanks that analyze the issue of gender gaps in various dimensions. Last year, we made a roundtable on gender gap in business. We did roundtable in Russian Economic Congress on gender gaps in labor markets, and today we are discussing politics. I would say that the problem of gender gap in politics, in public governance, is well understood by many. This is one of the components of Sustainable Development Goal number 5. This is gender equality. And while me and my colleagues read voluntary national reports submitted by almost 100 countries to United Nations, we found that almost all of them, with very few exceptions, mentioned the very little representation of women in public policy. However, at the same time, by reading these reports, we also found that very little options available for policies to change the situation, and very few countries use them. In this regard, it's very important to share experiences of countries that managed to succeed in this dimension, and to share it with countries that are now very far behind and need to introduce some policies which will change the situation. So this is the issue that we will discuss today, the situation in several Eastern European countries with regard to gender gap in politics and public policy. And later on, we will also have opportunity to ask our very distinguished colleagues and friends to share their experience of being in real politics in countries and share their experiences with us and audience. And we want to think about how to use the experience to improve situation in our countries. So we start our roundtable with a presentation by Pamela Kampa, professor from Stockholm School of Economics, and our colleagues from Stockholm Institute for Transition Economy. And there will be some general overview of the problem, how the economics, how economic research addresses this issue and identify the main problems in this area. Pamela, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Natalia, for organizing this event. I'm very happy to be part of this. Yes, since we don't have a lot of time, I will just try to hear the slides that are not responding. Sorry, okay. I will go straight into the presentation. So this is a general overview that we provided in the policy report that we published under the FROGE initiative, where we basically reviewed the literature on why are women underrepresented in politics. And we also touched a bit on what are the policies that, what do we know about policies that potentially can address the gender gap in politics. And this literature, I should say, this literature review is not, is limited to the realm of economics, because this is our background, but I will try, I will refer from time to time also to some work in political science. I'm sure there are more references that we're missing, but we will try to give a good overview of what we know and what we do not know about the causes of women underrepresentation in politics. So we start with the observation that women, the representation, the underrepresentation of women in politics persists, and there has been progress over time, which of course varies across countries, but this is slow and scattered. There are different ways in which we could show this. One way is to look at the global gender gap edited by the World Economic Forum, which basically ranks countries worldwide based on their level of gender gap. Here there is basically an index where ideally 1 will mean that there is no gender gap, and so any value lower than 1 will mean that there is a certain extent of gender gap along different dimensions. So the dimensions that are considered are health and survival, educational attainment, economic opportunity and participation, and political participation. And the point of this figure is that, as you can see, among all these categories, the largest gap that we are still seeing worldwide is in political participation. And it is also a dimension over which there has been some progress, because it's where we have more room of improvement, but the progress does not seem to have gone nearly far enough. All the way, these are data up to 2018, not much changed actually if we if we consider also the 2 following years up to 2020. One thing to notice is that this underrepresentation of women in politics is higher the more senior is the position that they look at, which leads policymakers, advocates, and academics to talk about the leaky pipeline. So the progress over time has basically interested mostly lower level position in politics. We have more and more women entering these positions, but then we tend to lose them as we go up the career ladder. And there are a few examples that we will bring about it. A notorious example is, for instance, Sweden. We're going to have a discussion from someone with a lot of experience from Sweden later on. One thing that we know about Sweden is that the extent to which women are represented in parliamentary and even ministerial positions is actually quite high, one of the highest in the world. Yet, in this longest history of the Swedish democracy, there has never been a female prime minister. So even in a gender equal country, the challenges are still there. So what do we know from the economic literatures about the causes of women underrepresentation in top political jobs? So as I said, I'm going to take an economics perspective, and we economists tend to try to explain the world always in terms of demand and supply forces. And in this case, we are going to basically discuss the causes of women's underrepresentation in politics in terms of demand and supply factors. So first we start with the supply side of the market for female politicians. So there is this idea that one reason why women are underrepresented in politics is that there are just not enough women who are willing to enter the political competition. So there is this reason, this hypothesis that political parties and voters would really like to see more women, but just women don't want to be there. What is the evidence from the data on the importance of this factor? So there is some indirect evidence that comes, for instance, from some survey data. Survey information that was collected in the US in several waves, starting in 2004, but then there were follow-ups to these surveys. And they show that women who have, based on their professional credentials, the same potential to become political candidates as men, tend to express lower interest in holding elective office as compared to comparable men. So these are not like just any woman, but women who, based on their educational background, profession, age, etc., you could expect could be interested in a top political job. And when these women are interviewed about why they're not interested in these jobs, it seems that the relevant factors are that they feel to be less encouraged to take these positions. And they mention factors such as family encouragement or party level encouragement. But also they themselves think that they're less qualified to run as compared to men. Then there is more indirect evidence that lead us to think that there might be some supply-side explanation. So one is that there is a large literature in economics documenting across several environments how women tend to shy away from competition more than men. They just don't like to compete as much. And if we think of politics as a competitive job, then we understand that this factor could play a role in explaining why women will not want to run. Moreover, it has been observed that women might be more constrained than men by family and relational considerations. So I'm not going specifically into any of the papers mentioned, but there is this one that I do want to describe a bit more in detail because I think it's very interesting. This is evidence from Sweden, where Olle Folk and Jonna Rickne basically show that in Sweden, women who are council members in municipalities and who are promoted to the top job at municipal level, the job of mayor, tend to experience an increase in the probability of having a divorce from their partner as compared to men. And the authors of this research speculate that this getting to these top political jobs can put some constraints on women in terms of family relational consideration. In anticipation of these constraints, women might not want to run for political jobs. Now, this is, as I said, indirect evidence. Really, do we know whether quantitatively this is important in explaining the bulk of the underrepresentation that we've seen, for instance, documented by the World Economic Forum? We don't know exactly, but the impression that I get from the literature is that this should not be the main factor. Because also, if we look, for instance, at what happens when countries introduce gender quotas, I've studied with Manuel Baues extensively a gender quota that was introduced in Spain. One thing that we look at is whether there is a list attrition. So once lists are forced to increase substantially their share of women, if there are not enough women who want to run, some of these lists will just not be able to basically participate to the election. Do we see evidence of this? Not at all. There is no list attrition when quotas are introduced. And at the same time, there is no evidence that introducing gender quotas reduces the quality of the elected politicians. So if, again, we didn't have enough qualified women who run for jobs, once political parties are forced by quotas to still have more women in rank and file positions, then we should see a decrease in the quality of the elected politicians. To the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence whatsoever from several contexts, Spain, my work, then there is a work in Italy, in Sweden, no evidence whatsoever that quota reduce the quality of the elected politicians. So then let's look instead at what we call the demand side factors. So here, what is the demand side of this market? They are the voters and the parties. So the idea is that there might be some discrimination of women, either on the side of the voters or on the side of parties, or both. So first of all, are voters biased against female politicians? Here I will use two approaches to look at the evidence. First, we look really at some survey data where voters are asked, this is from the World Value Survey, or actually survey respondents are asked, whether they agree with the statement that men make better political leaders than women do. And given our regional focus, I show here the share of agreements with this statement along countries, transition countries. You see that the share of agreement in non-EU transition countries is quite high. So what does this data tell us? So where the share of agreement with this statement is like 70%, 80%, then we think that probably voters play a role in explaining why there are not a lot of women participating in politics. In countries such as, say, Poland, where instead this share is lower, around 30%, we don't really know whether this is a relevant factor because, importantly and interestingly, I think, the same survey does not ask the opposite question. So you're not allowed to say whether you think that women make better political leaders than men do. So we don't know what the rest of those respondents really think about women in politics. So this is not extremely conclusive. And in general, here I report the work of a very well-published and very knowledgeable in this field political scientist, Crook, who assesses the literature in political science, and she concludes that the evidence from the literature on the role of discrimination from voters is mixed. And I will conclude the same thing from the economic literatures. For instance, also in my work with Manuel Baues on gender quotas in Spain, we look at whether parties that are forced by quotas to increase their share of women by a larger extent see a deterioration in their electoral performance. We don't see evidence of this, so they're not punished by voters because they have more women. So this speaks against the idea that voters will not want to see more women in electoral lists. On the other hand, a very nice recent paper published by Barbanchon and Savagnant in France shows that if we consider the same female candidate across several districts in French elections, we see that this female candidate tends to attract fewer votes in areas where they also measure more traditional gender role attitudes, based on surveys, based on the extent to which there are gender gaps in the labor market, etc. So this suggests that depending on their attitudes toward gender equality, voters might tend to vote less in favor of women if these attitudes are more traditional. And finally, what is the role of parties? The role of parties seems to be important across all the literature that we have reviewed. So they really seem to act as gatekeepers sometimes. And I'll just mention here one work that relies on data from Spain, but it is consistent with other evidence that comes from other research. So Esteve-Vollard and Baues find that in Spain, Spanish parties tend to nominate women to poorer position on the ballots, although women do attract more votes when they run. Of course, this does not necessarily mean that parties are discriminating against women, but one piece of evidence that makes the authors conclude that parties are potentially discriminating against women is that when the competition is really high, when the party really needs to compete to attract as many votes as possible because the election is uncertain, then women are promoted to better position on the ballot. So it seems that parties are aware of the fact that women are not discriminated against by voters. If anything, voters seems to like them, but when they can, when there is no electoral cost, then they do not promote women. And this conclusion that parties act as gatekeepers is also consistent with, again, the introduction of gender quotas and the fact that when quotas are introduced, there is not a deterioration in the quality of politicians. There is not a deterioration of the electoral performance of the parties that have to increase their share of women. So all this says that those women could have been there before, just they were not there, not because there were not enough women who could run or the voters didn't want to see them, but because the parties were acting indeed as gatekeepers. Now, finally, what is the evidence about the policies to address women underrepresentation in politics? So I have to say that most of the literature really focuses on gender quotas, in part because they have been adopted in many countries worldwide and there are different types. And overall, of course, it's hard to summarize this huge literature in just a couple of seconds. But what we can say is that the effectiveness of quotas really seems to depend on the design and on the context. One aspect that is very important to emphasize is that quotas seem to be useful to take some systems out of a vicious circle, because gender inequality are self-reinforcing. So groups that are male-dominated tend to be less likely to elect a female leader. This we see from research, from laboratory research. So then we need to have a higher share of women in groups in order to promote more female leaders to higher positions. Other policies have been less studies. For instance, there are some training programs offered by some international organizations. Really, there is not a lot of database evidence on the extent to which these work. Women's organizations within parties are an instrument that potentially can promote women's access to higher positions in the parties. There has been some concern that actually this instrument can backfire, creating some basically polarization within parties between women and men. There is no evidence in the data that the existence within parties of these women organizations hurt their career. Another policy that is more general that has been suggested by Folke and Rickner based on the evidence in their paper is that in general, we should work to improve the distribution of economic roles within couples, because these inequalities transfers into these relational and family constraints that could hold women back from seeking better positions. And of course, which policies can change gender role attitudes is a huge question that we cannot answer there, although there is a lot of literature in economics about this. Finally, one point that we would like to make is that looking at the data, we realize that the constant monitoring of gender gaps is very important, because even when we see progress, it's never linear. So it's important not to lose focus on measuring the extent to which there is gender discrimination in politics, or women's underrepresentation in politics. And it is part of some ongoing effort, even at FROGI level, where we have been working, or one institute in our network has been working on building a gender equality index that, among other things, tries to track progress in political empowerment in countries in transition. So this is all for me. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm very happy later to answer some questions.
Thank you, Pamela, very much. It's very thorough review of the existing research and literature, and the ultimate list of policies or areas of policies where there are some evidence that it might work for women empowerment. What the list is contains quotas, training programs, organizing women within parties, and changing social status of women through working with couples and empowering women in families and society, which will definitely have an effect on the representation in public governance and monitoring. That's where economists and researchers will definitely be important actors. Thank you very much. And I think that what we will discuss and see how countries in our region, in our geographical region, and contribute to this improvement of the situation. However, I would, before we're going to colleagues with countries overview, I will change a little bit the plan, because I got information that our colleague Corey will be facing some time constraint. I would like first to ask a question to her. Corey, you don't mind? So first of all, I would like to introduce Kori Udovicki. She's a Serbian politician, former Deputy Prime Minister of Serbia, and also worked in many roles in the government of Serbia, both ministerial positions, Minister of Public Administration, Energy, and very different. So it's a huge experience. And the important thing that Kori is also economist by education. She holds PhD from Yale. And so I think this is unique composition of experiences and skill of Kori allows her to put this economic perspective on the real life politics and the problem of women empowerment and politics. And important thing is she's also from all her experience comes from Eastern Europe. So I think it's a very unique combination of background, which is important to this discussion. Kori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I did not expect you to rearrange the timing, but as we are running a little bit late, probably this is optimal, and I really appreciate that. And I'll tell you, I apologize to everybody because I don't normally accept something unless I can stay, and I thought that I could, but politics in my country is becoming complicated, and I am actually joining a neighborhood movement to repel some illegal construction. And I've asked them to move the meeting from 7 to 7:30 in the evening, but I couldn't ask them to move it more. Anyway, I'll start from my oldest experience, which is actually the academic, to just actually give a suggestion that might be interesting to some of you doing research, particularly on women, but also maybe I myself keep hoping to apply it to ideas of growth. There's a paper by Burton-Singer and Heckman, both as statisticians. Burton-Singer is not an economist. Ages ago, I heard about it while studying, and I'll send it to anybody if you're interested. But what they did was to research why women with PhDs over the course of their lifetime publish cumulatively less than men. If they took men and women with equally prestigious degrees, PhDs, and so on, and when you plot over the lifetime of a woman and a man, there would be a cumulatively larger difference in publications. And of course, first they tried all the usual econometric methods, and they found that, having children was statistically significant. I don't know, some other factors as well, but the residual kept being very large. And finally, what they did was longitudinal interviews. with people that had graduated, I mean, obtained their degrees, if I remember correctly, actually before World War II. So they had now a long lifespan of experience. And women would even say, and they could see that in the results, that after when they had children, they wouldn't publish, but afterwards, since they had had time to kind of reflect at home, they would have actually bursts of publications and so on. But the point is that when they did this longitudinal analysis, they realized that the difference was the result of accumulation of factors. That things, when events happened, if they happened, often men and women would react differently to them. And that women had less confidence and had less spite or whatever. For example, I remember that one of the examples was if a thesis advisor had been discouraging, more often the men would say, I'll show him, whereas women would say, yeah, I should not have even thought that I can do this, and so on. And so this accumulated. And I really think a lot in life, and in social sciences actually happens in this way, and that would be an interesting approach to kind of finding an explanation, because as I looked also at the introductory discussion, the yawning gap, I mean, women in Eastern Europe are actually the best, or the smallest gap in 4 dimensions, but the political dimension is by far the worst. And why doesn't it surprise me? And I have to say that I've been reflecting, reading on this, preparing for the discussion. And I really think there are 2 aspects to politics. One is actually public service, and the other one is power. And I don't know whether what I'm going to say is terribly, I don't know, to me it's like an elephant in the room. To me it seems so obvious, but maybe it's very wrong in the literature on women to say something like this, but it's similar to this finding about that men are more competitive. Well, when it comes to raw power, to enjoying in the couloirs and back channels of power, I think women are less likely to enjoy the means than the ends. And unfortunately, in Eastern Europe, politics is still very, very raw, very, very strongly about raw power. It's about performing whatever to be in power. And so much so that, Natalia, I kind of felt uncomfortable when you introduced me as a politician. I actually don't see myself as a politician. I was always a technocrat. And I was called in for the other aspect of politics. Somebody has to be doing work. And I was liked and disliked for that very same quality, that it was obvious I'm somebody who works hard and who's honest and who knows whatever she thinks she knows or has focused on doing. But people, even from the voters' side, let alone from the political parties' side, by the way, I was never, not ever since after communism, I was never a member of a party. They don't really trust that I can solve the trickier problems that are related to, let's just say, networks of power, not to speak of whatever, less wholesome aspects of it. So in a way, you like your politicians to be honest, but you don't really like them to not be capable to solve all sorts of problems that you think you might need resolved in order for your wants and your interests to win. Let me give you an example. I was a minister of energy in Djindjic's government early on. And okay, this is stretching it. I was very unpopular because I started as a real technocrat, and the first thing I said was that the electricity price needed to be increased. So maybe I should not read anything else into my experience. But I had this feeling that people were irritated by my being a minister of energy. in another dimension. And at first I thought it was because it wasn't seemly for a woman to deal with energy. And obviously I'm not an engineer, and to be honest, I really found out where the electricity, I don't even know how they're called in English, for security in my apartment are only after I became a minister. I was really, I think, good in what the country needed for the position as an economist, since it was massively mismanaged, but I was not an engineer. However, I was then nominated for to become the governor of the central bank. I cannot tell you, it was like a vibe. Suddenly, there was this feeling as if that was the right place for me. I felt that reaction from the public. They absolutely had no problem with my being the governor of the central bank. And I have to admit that I realized it only later, that I think it wasn't the electricity circuits that did not befit a woman. It's that the people know very well that the energy sector is one of the most corrupt, complex, power-related sectors that there are. And the truth is, I wasn't dealing with them. I didn't have too much time and opportunity either, but because this didn't last too long. But I want to tell you that. I think this is true. I think, yeah, they were right. So I find it very worrisome now. I mean, one observation I've had, because I was also in the international development assistance circle, so then I got to meet a lot of high-level public officials in different countries. And it struck me always how in dictatorships, you often had these really committed, number 3, not even number 2, people that were women, and that I really liked. You could see they did not deal with politics. It was top civil service. It was real commitment to just doing good, to public service. But they, and I remember thinking, my goodness, in every regime, you'll find good people trying to do their best, regardless. But it is more so women, I have to say. And unfortunately, they are not threatening to the person in power. And this is why, it'll be the level number 2 or number 3, and they get things done. It does, I mean, if we look at our Eastern European politics, think of, who were the women? Okay, some of them. I mean, there are the Maggie Thatchers of this world, and in Eastern Europe, I have to say, Serbia has one strong woman that's real politician. I don't necessarily like her, but I really think she is a good, strong, power-loving politician. But other than that, it's mostly pawns, or in the case of, for example, the wonderful example of the president of Slovakia, Mrs. Čaputová, it's in the NGO sector where we can be really fighting for purer results, not power, but only public service. And she's managed to do the transition, and I wish her the best. I cannot say that I've followed in much detail how is it going. And just to wrap up, what can be done? Well, of course, one is to, fight for cleaner politics and simpler politics that can actually be in the service of the public. And the other is indeed, I think, help to family, to changing family relations. I've had the most supportive spouse that an Eastern European woman can have, but that's still not the same as the wife that follows her politician husband. And I could have used a wife. And also, I do think it might be actually the role for women in the region that it is almost the only topic that different parties have come across the benches in the parliament in Serbia, was when women got together to get the quota laws first introduced and then changed and so on. But maybe that's who has to get together to also work on improving the quality of politics. Thank you very much.
Corey, thank you very much for your very sincere sharing of your experience and your reflections. I think it has a lot of important points that that have some grounds in Russia. Definitely, not surprisingly, very successful Russian central banker is a woman, and so I think it's those issues of experience, about ambitions, about education, and interest to empowerment. It's very important, but it's although many of these qualities, they are not what people born with. That's what society introduced upon them. And that's, in my view, it's very important also to think about a social changing in social perception, which is very important to overall empowerment for women, not only in politics, but it definitely also will be very helpful. But that's where these qualities we develop from. Thank you very much, and I think our next speakers will also have things to say that will interact with what you have already said. And in going to our next speaker, I would just say to our audience that what we are presenting now is the outcome of our joint efforts to put down a policy brief, Women in Politics, and each subsequent speaker will describe the situation in their country, which is part of the appendix to this policy brief. You can download and you can find this policy brief in our website, freepolicybriefs.org, where we put all our papers, briefs, and activities. So I would like to give a floor to Alexander Grigoran from American University of Armenia, who will present the situation in Armenia from the point of view of women in politics. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Natalia, for this great opportunity to come together one more time and discuss gender issues in Eastern European and post-socialist countries. Today, I'm going to have a brief discussion on the women representation in politics in Armenia. And by the way, this is not a part of this policy briefs that we have, because our policy brief was based on a global data, but hopefully it can become a small policy brief and can be circulated. I take the opportunity and use the gender equality index that had been developed by our colleagues from my set. And what I actually looked at is the dynamics of the political and economic dimensions. So we have a distinct dimension in this index, which is about power, and then there is this political power of women in terms of the share of members in parliament, and then we have the economic power. This is in terms of the share of boards in largest quoted companies. And we could see a dramatic improvement in Armenia when it comes to the proportion of women in the parliament. There is this general positive trend, but as Pamela noted, the dynamics of gender gaps is typically non-linear. So here we see some kind of exponential growth in favor of the representation of women in the parliament. So from 2017, we have a dramatic increase, but even before we have some kind of improvement that it's kind of continual. In the meantime, what we observe is that the economic power, or so-called economic women representative, so economic representativeness of women is actually higher at any time point than that of political representativeness. And here we can have an interesting question whether there is this kind of causal relationship, or whether, let's say, the economic power is the driving force for the political power. So it's something to think about. And I think that there is something like that, because in Armenia, what we observe quite systematically is that women are more inclusive when it comes to business, and their involvement are more systematic, and the gap is smaller when it comes to economic and the business and other societal areas compared to that in political institutions. So I believe that demand side factors dominate when it comes to the explanation of women representativeness in politics. But of course, there are some supply side factors. And again, I give some thoughts, and maybe later on our team can focus and further develop. So I would say that the general improvement of women representativeness in politics is a part of the general tendency. And as it is well known from the literature, women are better in or less exposed to corruption. That they can be more committed when it comes to organizational or even, let's say, human level relationships. So overall, I would say that this improvement is a part of the general tendency. But I would also distinguish this number of civic movements that we had in the decades 2010 and 2020. And my perception is that that was a supply side driven. So in this movement, some of them environmental, some others pure political, you could see many young ladies trying to protest, and these protests have been pretty long-lived, like can go to even 30-40 days, even 2-3 months, and then in the streets you could see many women. And I'm not an expert in gender studies in such a deep way as we have in our network, but my feeling is that that was kind of supply driven. So women have been really facing themselves some political constraints, and then they wanted to change the status quo. Concerning the demand side, I think so far what we observe is that women are represented in national parliament as a sign of democracy. It's more about being there de jure rather than de facto. But things change, and this changes starting from 2017-18 are they seem to be continual, and especially in the light of recent election results, when the political party headed by Pashinyan won, and they started their journey from the Velvet Revolution. And it can be that we will have some kind of de facto change in women representativeness in politics in Armenia. And finally, I want to reiterate this idea that perhaps, as in many countries, it is also the case in Armenia that economic representation of women is strong and powerful enough to project and translate into political representation. I personally believe in this hypothesis, and this is about the role of institutions that eventually bring changes in gender gap, as in any other area or phenomena in our life. Thank you. This is all. I believe that I was limited in my 5 minutes. I'll be happy to address your questions and elaborate in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, for the overview station in Armenia and your insights on the importance of economic empowerment for a changing situation in the leadership. It's definitely very important, and gender gaps in labor markets, in wages, which are also important for the overall well-being of women and families in countries. In our countries, it's definitely should be one of the priorities, and it is much easier, at least in my experience, to tell with the local governments, with governments about economic empowerment rather than a political empowerment. But that might be a way in such situation to go forward. Thank you, Alexander. And now I give a floor to our next speaker. This is Lev Lvovsky, and I think he is from Berok Economic Research Center from Minsk, Belarus. And I think this is the country, Belarus is a country which showed very important role the women might play in changing and pushing situation in countries. It's a very unique experience. I think we will learn this experience in the future, and definitely it should have a very strong impact on the situations with women empowerment generally in Belarus. Lev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia. Thanks to all my colleagues. It was really interesting story and thoughts by Cory Udovicki. I hope I pronounced it right. And of course, special thanks to Natalia Volchkova, who organized this event. Well, as a preface to my story, I'll say that in order to have women in politics, you need to have politics on the first place. And there are some issues with that in Belarus. The story of female empowerment and female participation in politics in Belarus is rather traditional for a post-Soviet country, but with a rather unexpected twist at the end. We inherited from Soviet Union several traditional views on gender roles, together with very high labor force participation rates of women, high representation of women on middle and top management positions in different types of business, including state-owned enterprises. Another thing that used to be in Soviet times was 30% quota for females in national legislature. We used to have it, but then somewhere in the 1990s, it was cancelled, and people started to show how many women they would really like to have in National Assembly. And after this 30% quota was cancelled, share of women in National Assembly went to just about 5%, representing these traditional gender roles and traditional views about women in politics. In the most recent World Values Survey, 60%, well, 59% of Belarusians said that men make better political leaders than women do. And these surveys were made as recent as 2017, 2020. So it's like practically the modern views, well, before the political crisis. In 2004, then President Lukashenko brought 30% quotas back. The rumors actually say that he decided to make this quota back after talks to Swedish representatives, representatives of Swedish Foreign Ministry, just to show them that he actually can increase this formal number. But again, National Assembly had very limited power. So this 30% of women made little to no change to overall female empowerment or even to their own empowerment. In 2020, we had elections, and well, by now probably very famous elections. In the beginning, all three major opposition candidates were males, and they were getting very high rankings, pre-rankings before elections. But then all of them either were put to prison or had to fled the country. And in what was actually unexpected, women stood on their place. So in the beginning, there was a woman from representing each of these former male candidates. And with time, this female trio, as they started to be called here, they became sometimes more popular than their husbands, than men that they were representing. These traditional views that women cannot become really electable politicians in Belarus were widely held, and also were held by then President Alexander Lukashenko. And that was part of the reason why he allowed a wife of one former candidate to be actually registered as a presidential candidate. He mentioned in a number of interviews that women cannot become president of Belarus, that constitution is very hard for women, was not written for women. So probably he thought that most of the society, which was supported by World Values Service, most of the society would never vote for women, despite the protests or pro-government. What happened next is that a number of trustworthy sources and partially collected evidence showed that actually majority of Belarusians indeed voted for this placeholder candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. We estimated that from 60 to 80% of Belarusians who voted for her. So this idea that a woman cannot be elected is now part of the history. Probably views of Belarusians did not really change that much. And probably if situation would be different, Belarusians would still vote for a male candidate. But this unexpected move, unexpected series of events, I think made many Belarusians think again about their beliefs, think again about at least the general possibility that a woman can be a good political leader. Some recent polls showed that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Maria Kolesnikova, who was head of Viktor Babaryka's team. Viktor Babaryka is the most popular candidate. So they actually hold rather high electoral rankings even right now. So what will be next, what we'll see in future is a mystery, but I think that events of 2020, 2021 really changed the views of many Belarusians on women in politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Lev, for describing very important Belarusian experience, and it definitely should have strong impact on the development of the gender gap in politics in your country, and I think it might have spillover in others as well, because this experience is important not only to learn from in Belarus, but also in other countries. And I think that we are in a good position to do research on this impact in foreseeable future. Thank you, Lev. And before going to next speaker, I would like to invite our guests in the audience, who are more than 60 people, it's around 70 people we have in audience. We would like to know where you're joining us from. There will be a link to the poll shortly in the chat. Please take a few seconds to give your replies, and later on we can see the map of our audience, which is important to see whom we are talking with, and to see who are interested in this topic. Now I would like to give a floor to next speaker, David Keshalava from Georgia ISEC Policy Institute, which is also our another think tank in our network. And David, please, the floor is yours, and we are looking for your view on the situation in Georgia.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, for that very interesting event where we listen a lot of interesting ideas about women in politics. This is very big problem for Eastern European countries, including Georgia. So sharing experience of the other countries might be very useful for us. So today I will talk about women in politics in Georgia, try to describe situation in Georgia based on our policy brief, and explain what we think might be the reason behind low participation of women in politics, and talk a little bit about our new policy of introducing gender quotas in Georgia and how it worked. It might be a very good experience for other countries as well. So as a starting point, as in most of the countries we discussed before, Georgia has some problems in terms of women's participation in politics. If we look at the women's representation in different levels of government, we will see that we're far away from equal distribution. For instance, if we take national parliament women's representation, we just in 2020 achieved the historical maximum of the country, which is 20% representation of Georgian women in the parliament. And as you see from the graph, it is big improvement if you compare the beginning of 1990s, where it was just close to 6% representation of women in the parliament. But we see that we are very far from the equal distribution still, despite the improvement over time. We have even worse situation in terms of women's representation in local self-governments. If we exclude Tbilisi, for instance, and consider the other regions, women's representation is close to 13.5% in the recent 2017 local self-government election, which is also historical maximum. So we had even lower share of women in local self-government in Georgia. So it's very underrepresented. We have problems in the executive part of the government as well. So despite the fact that we have the equal number of ministers in terms of gender, if we look at the deputy ministers and the top positions in the ministries, it's very male dominated. So very small percentage of women are represented in these positions. The only institution where representation of women is quite high is common law courts, which is kind of the top committee which is trying to elect court judges. So it's very important position, and representation of women and men are close to equal in this position. Otherwise, we are very underrepresented, but the thing that we want to mention here is that improvement is quite large if we compare the previous years. So we try to somehow investigate, so what could be the reason behind women's underrepresentation, and we tried based on the different surveys and researches done within the country to identify some factors. So first, there are some supply side factors. As Pamela has already mentioned, one of the reasons might be women's attitude towards campaigning in political environment. There was very interesting survey done in Georgia, not only in Tbilisi, but other regions as well. Women were asked what they think about participating in politics, and the main outcome was most of the women, great majority of the surveyed people were saying that politics is like a dirty business, and due to negative pre-election campaign, which is quite common for Georgia, especially recently, the political pre-election campaign is mostly negative, just criticizing each other and telling very not much about the plans, what they're going to do when they undertake the government. Women, great majority of women did not like the idea to participate in pre-election process, and they were saying that one of the reasons that they don't want that is to avoid this discomfort to children and family members. Another very important supply side factor that we think might have an impact on low participation of women in politics is women's unequal distribution of family responsibilities in the country that causes women's very low participation in the labor market. Plus, for the women who are still in the labor market, they have kind of double burden that prevent them to accumulate some additional knowledge, attend trainings, have being actively involved in social life, and so on. If you look at the recent surveys, for example, UNFPA 2020 survey, 80% of family duties are done by women separately, and childcare services are mostly also, work is mostly done by women as well. This might be like a preventive measure of women to participate in politics more. In terms of demand side factors, there were a lot of times mentioned that here important factor is an attitude of voters and political parties about how good leaders women might be. And we have the survey done in Georgia, according to which about 62% of men and close to 40% of women are thinking that women are worse political leaders than men. The same way, 63% of men and 42% of female respondents are thinking that politics is a male's domain. But here it needs to emphasize that if we compare the same survey done many years ago, there is a big improvement. But improvement does not happen in terms of men. The percentage is similar in terms of men, but it happens in terms of women. For example, 3-4 years ago, the percentage of females thinking like that was close to 60%. So it's decreased tremendously. That is good news because it gives you some hint about the transformation of norms and stereotypes related to women as leaders. And one very good example of recent parliamentary election in 2020 in Georgia that gives you a good lesson about the attitude of political parties and voters toward women candidates is that we in parliamentary election have two parts of the election. The first is election based on party list, so it's proportional part of the election, and the second part is majority election, where representatives of political parties have competition in the different municipalities. And we had introduced quota in proportional part, but there was absolutely no restriction in majority part, and political parties have freedom to nominate their candidates regardless of their gender. And we found out that about 23.3% of the candidates were women only, and only one woman managed to win that competition in one of the municipalities. Other did not manage to do so, which again indicates not very good situation in this regard. And lastly, about the policy, I just in the beginning mentioned that I want briefly to mention the recently introduced gender quotas in Georgia and how it worked. According to the quota, every one member of the party list out of 4 must be different gender, so must be women in our case. And the aim of this type of introduction of this type of quota is to achieve 25% of representation of women, but we ended up about 20% representation of women at the end of the day, because most of the political parties, there was 1 or 2 exceptions only, listed female candidate as a 4th in the list. So the top 3 were men in most of the cases, and some political parties did not manage to get more than 3 candidates in an election, and that's why we ended up to only 20% representation in the quotas. We recently increased the quota actually, and in the next election there will be 1 out of 3 candidates in a list must be different gender according to the new legislation. We think that these kind of gender quotas just helped to achieve some result, but it was not as productive as expected before due to many different reasons. There are the other recommendations that I just briefly list and don't talk much about them. It's about increasing female labor force participation, which is problematic in my country, policies addressing unpaid care work burden, and women-tailored capacity building trainings also might contribute to women's participation. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm waiting for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David, very much. It's very interesting for me to learn that Georgia has quotas and actually already changing the quotas for women representation in political parties. This is a very important step, and we are definitely will be looking for the research done on this issue in Georgia, because we are looking for the evidence and that can be used in order to promote these kind of policies in other countries as well. And it is very important experiment, I would say, in that regard, but I think it will have strong effect ultimately on changing both supply and demand side of the problem. Definitely for women, it's a good signal to learn and be prepared and be part of this political process. I would like to remind our guests to take a poll, to answer a poll question on the geographical location of on the geographical location. It's just very interesting for us to see where you are now and whom we are talking with. There was some problem with the link. Now it works. Please answer this poll. And then I would like to give a floor to our next speaker, now from Baltic country, from Latvia, Dominic Gerber from Baltic International Center for Economic Policy Studies, which is also part of our network. And this is the country of European Union, and we expect to see some change, which might be driven by the fact that this is EU country. Dominic, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks very much to the organizers of this wonderful workshop for having me here. It's very interesting to listen to what's going on in other places in Eastern Europe. So I'm going to share with you some quick thoughts about women's political representation or empowerment in Latvia, which, as Natalie has already mentioned, is obviously a member state of the European Union. And to anticipate a part of the conclusion I do not think in anything I have researched on Latvia that the fact of being a European Union member is creating fundamental differences to some of the problems we have heard from Georgia or Armenia. So a few quick facts first. So the starting point of the Republic of Latvia a bit more than a century ago was pretty favorable, one might think, for the interests of women in terms of when it comes to political representation. So the very first draft of the Latvian constitution from 1918 explicitly claimed or contained the female suffrage. So women were supposed to be enfranchised from the very beginning on in the democratic Latvian constitution. This is relatively early if you take some other European older democracy, France and Switzerland, the country I'm from. So clearly, as a Swiss, nobody can be proud about the date when Switzerland enfranchised its female citizens. So what followed then since 1918 in the century that came was long periods, and I'm talking about the periods where Latvia was actually a democracy, where unsurprisingly women were very much underrepresented. If we take women in parliament, so until the 2018 elections of the Saima, which is the Latvian parliament, you never had more than 21% of female incumbents in the parliament. In 2018, that changed. So a pattern which has already been described by my colleague in Armenia. So the 2010s were, politically speaking, a good year for female representation. We see in 2018, after the elections, a big jump in the rates of female representations, up to 31%. So this has never been here before. And a year later, so when the 2018 Saima actually started working, I mean, you can see it when you take some relative facts here. So if you take just the Baltic states, we have the highest gender balance in the legislative body in Latvia, according to the data from the Interparliamentary Union. Latvia is number 4 in the entire CEE region when it comes to female representation in parliaments. And roughly speaking, today, or as per 2019, Latvian female representation in parliament is about equal to the European average. So here is basically on the left-hand side panel, you can see the graphical representation of this pattern. So once again, the 2010s were pretty remarkable when it comes to the increase of the female share in the parliament from 20% in 2011 to 30% or slightly more in 2019. We see also, as a side fact, a similar tendency in the EU and in the other Baltic states. Now one could conclude here and say, well, the picture here when it comes to female representation in Latvia isn't all that bad. It's pretty much in line with what we observe on average in the European Union. However, and here I'm inviting you to have a look at the two right-hand side panels where you see female representation in the government and female representation at the local level, where we do not see this picture in the 2010s. Executive representation of women is stagnating, and we have a diminishing tendency on the municipal level. I think that's a reason for concern. That's something that we should be very wary about in Latvia when the female representation on the level where most political careers on the top national level are starting experience diminishing rates of representation. There's probably something wrong that goes a bit against this beautiful picture one might see here. So very quickly on what should be done or what could be policy lessons when it comes to Latvia. So I have no time to develop on what the key obstacles are. We clearly do see some survey evidence that we have a political ambition gender gap in Latvia. That's not congruent with female voter turnout. So women in Latvia are actually more active participants in politics and elections than men, but that's not true for the ambition to start political careers. Second, we see ballot list discrimination, and I'm using the word here, in Latvia, and that's the next slide here. So blue is men and green is women, and you see the 7 largest political parties in the Latvian parliament, and you can see that consistently in 2018 on the ballot sheets, the nominated and the top 5 placed candidates on each party ballot list in all, with no exceptions, were majoritarily men. There's some 40% representation rates of women, but these are the exception. So that clearly indicates that we may have an issue here on women inclusion in the ballot sheets that then well, decide on who is going to be represented in the Saima. And third and finally, I think, and this is a hypothesis, which is a bit in the policy brief, which I wrote for the Free Network. We need to look further whether anything like that follows empirically. But I think there's a party system dimension of female representation as well. As we know, most post-Soviet democracies have a party system that is unlike the one we have in most older democracies in Europe, largely emerging based on clientelistic networks, power networks, or person-centered networks, networks where women have historically been underrepresented. So if this is what makes up your party system, it shouldn't be all that surprising that we don't see many women elected in politics. So nothing original to say on policy lessons. The Latvian government does not have quota, does not have any budget nor any law that would compel the government to actually monitor the development or create incentives, for example, in public schools on raising awareness, creating incentives for young women to consider political careers. So that's something that could be fixed by having a political will to do so. Gender quota as well, it's not there, it might be introduced. Gender quota alone will not be enough, as we know from the empirical literature, especially in proportional representation system like Latvia. It's not much of use when you force parties to have a certain percentage of women on the ballot lists, when all these women are then ranked last somewhere at the bottom of these lists. So we need additional rules for women to be placed high up in the perhaps top 5 places of electoral lists. And very last but not least, I think the local level dependency is concerning. There is something in Latvia that is at the local level that is not appealing for women, and we need to figure out what that is, because that's where the political careers are very often starting here. So with that being said, I'm concluding here, and I'm looking forward to hear your questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. It is very interesting observation that dynamics of gender representation might be going in different directions, different levels, and this is quite unexpected to observe that the municipal level is lagging behind. And it's also need to be taken into account that in terms of number of women at different levels, municipal level will be the one where it is there are many more women than at the national level. So this definitely has strong effect on the base for further career advancement of a large number of women because of the scale. The next speaker will be also not far from Baltic region, for the country that has also the Baltic coast. It's Monika Ochkovska from CENEA, Center for Economic Analysis in Szczecin. And I'm looking forward to her presentation on the estimation of impact of the gender quota in her country. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia. Many thanks to organizers for this interesting discussion on a very important topic. To fit into my 5 minutes, I actually selected just one experience I wanted to share with you that concerns Poland, which is exactly the gender quota and the problems mentioned just by Dominic and before by David or Pamela that are related to simple gender quota. So actually Poland introduced gender quota, 35% gender quota in 2011. And it is a very simple quota on the for the candidates list. And when you look at the maps I'm showing here with the proportion of women on the candidates list in the parliamentary elections for the lower chamber of the parliament in Poland, you can see that in 2007, so in the elections before the quota was introduced, and afterwards, right afterwards in 2011, the increase is huge, then somewhat small decrease, but all in all, the average proportion of women across all electoral lists increased from 23% in 2007 to 32% in 2019. But does that really mean that we have that many more female politicians, female members of parliament? Not necessarily. So when we look at the parliament, we can see that in 2007, for every 4 men in the parliament, we had 1 woman. In 2019, the proportion of female MPs increased to only 29%, even though the quota was in place, even though the proportion of females on the candidates list was much higher in 2019. So actually, what we see in the data and what has been already mentioned in the previous literature is that the probability of being elected declined after the quota was introduced. So what are the main problems behind it? And the barriers that women are facing in Poland. First of all, gender norms already mentioned within this discussion, of course. So still, Polish society considers politics as a male-dominated sphere. That's one thing. Another thing is the important role of internal party politics. Here I would like to show you with the simple graph and the proportion of women among candidates and further on among the elected members of parliament in these 3 elections from 2007 to 2019, but split by party. These are 2 major parties in Poland, center-left one and the conservative one on the right-hand side. And as you can see, there is this huge increase in the proportion of candidates that exceeds 35% since 2011. However, the proportion of elected members of parliament increased a lot, only for the center-left party, not so much for the conservative party. Why this happened, and what may be the potential other barriers that these female candidates are facing? One of the answers, at least, are the orange squares that you can see now in the graph. So this is the proportion of women who were placed first on the list, so at the top spot on the list, which is of course strongly correlates with your probability of being elected. And for the center-left party, the proportion, they not only put more women on their electoral list among the candidates, but they also placed a lot of women in the first positions on the list, so favorable ones, while for the conservative party, you cannot see that. So as my previous speakers already mentioned, not only legal mechanisms are important, but how you design them and how they what the society thinks, but also what the parties think inside is really important. Actually, that's everything. I'm looking forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Monica. It is a very interesting and important result of the analysis that the increase in participation and political participation of women is not translated one-to-one to real position in politics, but that's I would say to some degree should be expected because of increased competition. So there is not just women compete with men, but it's also competition among women for the positions. But still, the strong effect of the quota in Poland is a good indication that this policy definitely works. And there is a question by some of the guests to panelists. The question is about Russia. If introduction of the quota in Russia will change situation. And I think we need, I hope later on speakers can comment on this question, not only with regard to Russia, but to other countries as well in the world, because this is the general issue. It's always, whenever you start discussing quotas, the same question arises. So I would like now to give a floor to our next speaker. It's now a speaker from Russia, from High School of Economics, Natalia Firsova. And Natalia, the floor is yours, and I hope to see the some description of the situation in Russia, which has some, at least had some surprises for me when we started learning the Russian past and on in this regard. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
If you have problem with sharing, I will try to do this for you.
Can you see the slides at the moment?
No, but I will share it with from my computer. Just a moment.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Do you see it, Natalia?
Yes, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about female representation in Russian politics. And I have to say that Russia lags behind 80% of countries in women's political empowerment based on the World Economic Forum report, despite the fact that it has considerable comparative success in the areas of women's education and health. The highest levels of women's representation could only be seen in the lowest levels of political bodies and positions with the least real power, with some notable exceptions. As you see in the current State Duma elected in 2016, only 16% of deputies are women, which is the highest share ever in post-Soviet Russia. In the Federation Council, the upper chamber of parliament, the share of women's representation is similar, 17%. The regional representatives are not elected, but appointed by legislative bodies of constituent entities of Russia. Gender parity on the regional level of politics is on average slightly higher than on the federal level. The share of women in regional representative bodies is 18%. The highest proportion of female representatives is in the regions, oblasti, autonomous regions, and autonomous districts, where it amounts to 25% on average. Women are more fairly represented at the lowest municipal level of Russian politics. Nearly 31% of municipal deputies are female. And the current lack of gender parity in political representation in Russia could be considered somewhat surprising, given that the Soviet state pioneered the adoption of a constitution that gave women the right to vote and to hold elective office over a century ago, in 1918. Barriers for reaching gender equality in political representation are for the most part reflected in gender stereotypes revealed by the opinion polls. According to the latest available World Values Survey, the majority of the adult population in Russia considers that men make better political leaders than women. In 2017, a remarkable 51% of women agreed with this statement, while 45% disagreed. Among men, 65% agreed and only 31% disagreed. But more disturbing is the downward trend in supporting the idea of a woman becoming the president of Russia in the nearest 10 to 15 years. Such support decreased twice from 65% in 2006 to 49 among women and 19 among men based on Levada Center data. According to the Russian Public Opinion Research Center poll, the most frequent disadvantages of female politicians compared to male that adult respondents named in an open-ended question were soft character, being emotional, responsibilities outside of work, children, family, short-sighted nature, hasty decisions, and lack of professionalism. At the same time, on the legislation level, necessary provisions for gender equality are in place. Equal rights for women and men are guaranteed by the Constitution. Equal rights are declared in all major codes of law, and discrimination on the basis of sex is prohibited. Russia ratified or inherited ratification from the USSR the major international documents on the human rights of women. So the important question is it time to shift from gender equality to women empowerment in politics paradigm for Russia? And this question still have to be answered. The good news is that the problem of female underrepresentation in politics has been acknowledged in Russia. National Action Strategy for Women was adopted in 2017. As a result of its implementation, a thorough report on women's participation has been prepared. This report has identified two major challenges. Russian legislation does not promote positive measures to increase women's political representation. And Russia does not have bodies or institutions specifically representing the interests and promoting the human rights of women. And addressing these challenges could be the good starting point in solving the problem. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions. And if I have time, I will answer the question that Natalia mentioned about quota for women in Russia later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And I would use my option to be moderator to say that the plan already has some result. The leadership in Russia competition, leaders in Russia competition, which is now running 5 times in a row across the country, which allows people from different, from any region in Russia to participate and become to win in this competition and become to get to the list of the candidate for public positions. It's the introduction of this plan has a strong impact, and the number of female winners of this competition actually doubled get from 12% of women in the pool of winners to 25%. This is huge. This is why I think it's very important to talk about these issues and discuss it and show how important this is for the whole society. We have now the next speaker from another Eastern European country with the overview of situation. We have Timothy Brick from Kyiv School of Economics. And Timothy, we are looking for your presentation on the situation in Ukraine.
Great, thanks. Thank you everyone for your presentations. I really enjoyed it, and also thank you for this opportunity to present our brief. I'll be short. So my talk is based on two documents on our research brief, which was written by Christina Hulinska, my colleague, and also I draw some of my ideas from the conference which we hosted at Kyiv School of Economics in April. Some of you presented there. The conference was supported by the Free Network. So to summarize, there is a consensus among Ukrainian researchers, activists, and some politicians that gender quota is quite an effective tool. So we are quite satisfied with how gender quotas work in Ukraine. The recent quotas were introduced first in 2014 for the national parliament. Political parties were incentivized to receive a higher share of state support in case if they bring more women to the parliament. Then another gender quota was introduced at the level of local elections in 2015. However, it was not enforced. And then in 2020, this gender quota at the local level was enforced. So political parties were obliged to register at least 40% of women in the list. Moreover, it was specified that each 5 candidates should have at least 2 women. So that's how, in policy terms, we actually created this device to ensure that women should appear somewhere at the top of the list. So as you see at the local level, if we look at large communities, some region level councils, the progress was there. We had more women registered by all parties, and we also had more women getting there to local councils. However, there are still some concerns. And as some researchers, for instance, Tamara Martsynyuk and Irina Tyshkov, they are quite famous gender scholars in Ukraine, they did an additional study and they looked very carefully at small rural communities. And they discovered some issues there. So apparently before, in 2015, we had quite a lot of rural communities, so women were competing there. However, with the decentralization reform, we had this change that small communities were amalgamated in larger entities. So in these specific cases, when villages collided together, it became quite difficult for women to compete there. So there were some losses in terms of female empowerment and participation at the level of small rural areas. So as I promised, I'm quite brief today, but to summarize, I just wanted to say that in Ukraine, researchers generally agree that it is more about institutions than attitudes, culture, or social norms, and that the gender quota was quite efficient, even though there were some weaknesses and limitations. And that gender quotas should be maintained. They don't go anywhere, and we will keep having them, maybe tuning them to account for current limitations. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Timofey. I think that this your presentation of Ukrainian situation is a very good answer to the question of one of our guests on if water will be effective in Russia. So I think your results indicate a very strong effect, like doubling of the share of women in oblast level councils in Ukraine. I think it is definitely a very important result to learn from to other countries. And before I go to the next speaker, I would like first to show the results of the our first poll. And we have it's almost 60–70% of the guests voted on their geographical location, indicated their geographical location. You see that we have both east and west coast of United States, and we have quite substantial coverage of Europe and European part of Russia. We don't have people from Pacific, but it's probably because it's too late there. It is far beyond midnight there. And thank you for joining us. I hope we are not bored you with this discussion. I believe this issue is very important for all countries, irrespective how far they are now in solving the problem. And before one more poll that I would like to answer our guests and panelists, it is about some implication, because implication of the decreasing gender gap in politics. And one of the guests asked very important question, which we probably not very we haven't paid attention so far. This is the question the question is, what are the benefits of women participation in politics from the point of view of society? And I would like our speakers to think about this question and answer it after all, before we will close our roundtable. But at the same time, I would like to ask the participants to answer the related question. And the question is about the following. Do you think, what is your opinion? Do you agree that law or the high participation of women in politics and governance would better facilitate the societies to face the threat and obstacles that were brought to society by COVID pandemic? This poll will appear in the chat. I would like to ask everyone to answer the question to see how they perceive the potential role the women in political governance can play in the society with the application to the very specific situation of the economic crisis and medical crisis and the public health crisis caused by pandemic. And now I'm very happy to introduce our last but not the least speaker. We have another real life politician with a very extensive experience in politics. This is Agneta Dreber from Stockholm. And over her career, she held a number of political positions. She was also one of the founders of Stockholm Party in 1979, and one of her highest rank in the career in governance was being a mayor of the city of Stockholm, which is very, I think, demanding and very the position that requires a lot of power and a lot of efforts to hold. And I believe she was very successful at that position. And I would ask Agneta to reflect on experiences of the countries that were today discussed in our roundtable, and also reflect on the policies that Sweden used in order to promote gender balance and women empowerment in politics. Because whenever we're talking about gender equality, the first countries that are mentioned are Scandinavian countries. We are definitely need to learn more from their experience and propose change in our countries based on the successful policies implemented in those countries. Agneta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you for inviting me to this very important and interesting panel. First of all, I just want to say that I was only the vice mayor. The mayor was actually a man, but still I did have a lot of power and I could achieve a lot of things. I would like to make some comments and some reflections about what I read in your brief notes and also what I heard during this almost 2 hours. And first of all, I think if this was in Sweden, we would react to the fact that out of 7 or was it 8 different presentations, most of them were done by men. That would happen in Sweden because we would think that women need to speak for women, which might not be right, but that's how we have been thinking. But then again, when you take a look at what is needed, I realized that you have had a special seminar or webinar about business and about the labor market. And I think what is very important when it comes to getting more women in politics is to try to get rid of obstacles and barriers. And several of you, or many of you, have been talking about changing family roles. And I think this is extremely important. And we have done that in Sweden. We even say that it's impossible to change women's roles unless you also change men's roles. And as you might know, some of you, we have something called parental leave in Sweden. And from the beginning, of course, most of that leave was taken by women. But today we have a quota. So men have to take at least 2 months of parental leave. Otherwise, the family will not get that leave. That has turned out fairly well, but still there are few men taking this leave. Because nobody, no woman or man for that sake either, could actually make a career in politics or anywhere else unless you have good childcare. So I think you have to see to it that women feel safe and men when they are at work or when they are active in politics. If they worry about their children, they won't feel safe and they won't take these challenges, which it is to get into politics. And I also believe that it's important to see to it that women get education and training. You actually had, one of you had that very specific in your briefings. But it's not only about training for politics, it's also important to get a good basic education. I myself, I'm a graduate of the Stockholm School of Economics, which has been very helpful in all kinds of different positions that I have had, because you're also respected once you have a degree like that. And I believe that this is important, especially for women, if they do want to make a career, either in politics or in working life. But also, as I understand it, you have been talking about or writing about the fact that you have to know the rules of leading a meeting. You have to know what it means to be chair of a meeting. You have to know how to ask to get the floor, to say something. And women have not been as educated in this as men have. And we in Sweden, we have a very high figure or a high number of people being active in different trade unions. And actually, I think the trade unions have been a possibility for women to learn about all these structural questions, how to lead a meeting and how to make you heard on a meeting and how to make different proposals to get them through. And I also, when you talk about what, if I may try to answer that question about what can women what benefits are there of having more women in politics? I believe as it is now, women do have other experiences than men, but in a society where everything is perfect, of course, women and men will both have very high qualification and they will have about the same experiences. At least that's how we think in Sweden. But since that's not the case yet, I do believe that women's experiences are important in politics. And we had a study in Sweden showing that if there were more women on the municipal level, actually there were better and more childcare there too. So those municipalities who had more women, they had better childcare and more of it, good childcare than the other municipalities. So I think especially now, because there is another reflection that I make, and that's when you have been asking people if what they think about female politicians compared to male politicians. That's a question you could never ask in Sweden today, because nobody would say that it's not about their sex or the gender, it's about the individual. We have good female politicians and we have bad ones, and the same goes for men. And as you might know, we have 47% women in our parliament, and we have 54% women in our government. Of course, the government fell yesterday, as you might have heard, but it was not because of the women. It was in spite of having so many women, I would rather say. So I am, not to make this too long and to repeat what has been said, I would say that if you want to, and I'm not a researcher, I have to stress that too. I'm an ordinary person who has had a lot of different work and been in different places in the government's office, on the local level and on the regional level. But you have to take away the barriers. You have to see to it that you have childcare. You have to change men's roles. You should not let religion play a big part in because that would destroy these challenges to get more women in politics. And you should try to get rid of prejudice, because people have so much prejudice against what is possible for women and what's possible for men. And you should be well prepared as a woman once you take a step into politics, because we have a saying in Sweden: if you want to make a success in your work or in politics, you have to be twice as good as a man. But that's not very difficult. So that's what I would like to add to this panel. And thank you so much for having me. I loved participating.
Thank you, Agneta, very much. You actually put a list of very important issues that need to be solved together in order to increase and help women empowerment, because the problem of gender imbalances is not economic one. It is multi-dimensional. It's both economic, sociological, medical, philological, whatever. So it's actually linguistic. And because in Russia we have this problem how to name the position of women, because the traditional name for this position is had very strong male flavor. So it is a very multidimensional problem, and definitely cannot be solved by just quotas. And one of the guests asked question, how to prevent some women from teaching their daughters that their primary role is motherhood and child care. Because of this, many girls stop in their development and at work due to the fact that they have to take care of children. I think this is too radical approach to the problem. I still think that child care is a part of the life. It's part of the life of both women and men, and they need to be balance achieved with regard to this. And this child care, public provision of child care, is one of the important issue in a way of women to politics and public offices. which was emphasized by Agneta. I think this is very important to share experiences across countries to learn from best practices. And all countries has a different historical legacy with regard to this problem, and there is no unique way to solve it. This is why it is important to do research and to do this exchange of ideas and history is very important. And now when we are, by the way, the poll on the role of gender of women in potential effect on the results of COVID pandemic is unfortunately very simple, because except one answer, all answers are yes, that people believe that women will be more women in politics and governance will be good for preparing societies for such situations. And but it might be because we have very biased audience, the audience that it's not just random audience that answers this question, but nevertheless it's highlights the idea of the role that women in politics might play in getting balances between economics, health, and society ability to withstand important shocks. And now, before we end, I would like to ask all participants to answer very briefly on this question. What you think should be the priority of women in should be the prior effect of women in politics on the societies? What are the benefits of the society can get from having more women in politics and governance?
Well, let me start.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Liev, because I have a barking dog, so it's better that I don't speak.
Okay, well then I'll say just a very low-level economic thought. Women are 50% of the society, so just letting and encouraging them to do everything that men do will bring more talents on their places. They are not better, not worse. And if I don't know, every 10th individual is a good politician, then half of them would be women.
Yeah, I was going to make exactly the same point. The only thing that I want to add to that, like if you increase the pool, naturally you're going to get more talent if there is a distribution of talent in that pool. But even more to that, I agree with Liev that women are not better, no worse than men. However, if we think that education is a good proxy for quality of politicians, it is also the case that in the last decade, women are becoming more educated than men. It's more likely that they have a tertiary education. So we are really missing up on a lot of talent in that sense. And so just having more of these women in politics should improve the selection of politicians, which is fundamental for then good policy and good governance.
Thank you, Pamela. So, Alexander? Sorry, you switch on microphone, please, Alexander.
I'm sorry. I would probably echo what Pamela said concerning education. I think we need to search for, let's say, a number of factors to identify the selection rule of women, why they are kind of not involved as sufficiently as we would expect. So it's not only about, I mean, at least for countries like Armenia, it's not only about education, but it is more about the perceptions from the society side, how effectively women can be in specifically in the executive government. To what extent, how effectively they can have an impact on processes that are traditionally led by men. So maybe we have to go deeper and understand the gaps in social norms and informal rules at that level. At least I would say that Armenia and similar countries are facing primarily issues in such type of institutional level. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Natalia?
And I would like to add that to fight stereotypes and gender roles, you have to see more examples of women politicians. And after that, we will also see more examples of politicians' husbands, not only politicians' wives. So this will, I think, bring a lot of changes into society and a lot of changes in the role models that our children can see. So small things can bring large changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Who is next?
If I
Monica?
may. Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, exactly, since there is still a gap and women are underrepresented in most countries, in almost all countries, there is this unused potential. And they may bring a lot of good, not only education, but other very important factors into politics. Some of you mentioned that politics are related to power. So there is a good chance that having more women in politics may change the nature of politics and the problems that the politics is actually facing.
Thank you, Monica. David?
I totally agree with the arguments mentioned before about unused potential and talent plus role models as an important tool for fighting against stereotypes and roles in the society. But I would add that being more women in politics means more women policymakers, and it might have good impact on gender equalities in other dimensions as well, including like in the labor market or the other dimension. That is also quite important because there are a lot of unused potential there as well, like loss of some even GDP due to not employing the women in this dimension as we should. So I hope that being women more involved in decision-making process in politics will contribute in this direction as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. I think this is all issues that you raised are very important. Agneta, do you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I would just like to emphasize what you all said, that there are lots of talents that you miss in a society if you don't give women, or if you don't really take advantage of all that women know. And I also believe a lot in role models. You have to try to have some women to be models for for many other women and men in a way too. So I agree with what most of you have said. And I think you're working wonderfully and you're on your way, I would say, as I see it from Swedish point of view.
Thank you very much, Agneta. Thank you for all panelists and guests. I would like to I join all the comments from the speakers on the role of diversity. That's diversity, which is important for bringing talents, as much talent as possible. Without diversity, we cannot achieve this. And the issues of social norms is very important, and the role models. And I just want to finish with reflecting on what Natalia told about small steps, which might have strong impact. At New Economic School, our female faculty organized a club for female students to discuss the issue of career, of problems that might they faced in this way. And this is a small step that might have strong impacts to help your students, female students, to look beyond social norms. That's what this help is trying to achieve, to at each level to discuss these issues and break norms in a way which will ensure the empowerment of women in next generations. Thank you very much for all participants. I am very glad that you're able to join us in this panel, and I'm looking for further collaboration in other issues of the gender gaps. There are many of them to discuss and analyze and build data on. Thank you very much. Agneta, Corey left us already, but I'm very thankful that you find time to join us. It is very important to share these experiences and also play important role model for us and for the people in the audience. And thank you very much, and see you in the next meetings as well. Thank you for organizers at New Economic School that helped me to set this meeting, and I hope we, with very few small problems, we did it well. Thank you very much.